So, you've probably already heard about Janet Crouch and the latest tale from the Religio-Industrial complex. You know, the story about the mobile home that her church apparently subsidized for her two little dogs, an air-conditioned mobile home for the two little dogs. And I'm going to tell you that, while entertaining as that is, that's not the most important thing at all. I'm going to tell you what is most important, and I'm going to ask you to help, to do something about it. Because we get sidetracked by things that aren't quite so important. I mean, it's understandable. You get sidetracked by the over $5 million home that Janet Crouch has in Florida. There's his and her homes, because her husband, Paul, he has a home down the road, multi-million-dollar home, and they have his and her homes in California and other multi-million-dollar homes scattered around. So it's understandably distracting when you hear about the amount of wealth that these ministers have. Sure. And then you hear, of course, about the private jet. That's the private jet that's $49 million. And then they've got another jet, sort of a second jet, in case Paul or Janet's using one of the other jet, you've got a second jet to use to get around. That makes sense. And of course, the housing for relatives, quite understandable. Not just for kids, of course, but grandkids as well. You want to make sure the grandkids have housing on the church. No doubt about it. Extravagant housing, too. That goes without saying. You expect that sort of thing. We're getting a little closer to what's important when they talk about the chauffeur. That's right. Designating the chauffeur as a minister. Yeah. Also in their little Jesus park down in Orlando, Florida, the actor who plays Jesus there, he gets designated as a minister too when he's performing as Jesus. In fact, they acknowledge that they've got hundreds of people who are designated as ministers. Now, this is great for them because then they don't have to pay in for Social Security taxes. Yeah, they're not paying in for Social Security taxes. Others employers do, but not them. But even better is that some of these employees may potentially be getting the parsonage exemption that I've made such a big deal about, because then they get from their income, they get deducted the amount that's equal to the so-called expenditure on their housing. And when you're talking that many people, this might actually be money grabbed out of your pocket to subsidize mega ministers. Mega ministers like in the Crouch's case, who just gave a recent reverent memory for Chuck Colson. Chuck Colson, the guy who suggested that they firebomb the Brookings Institution, the guy who worked with Nixon on that little plumbers operation, that burglary operation at the Democratic National Committee that you may have heard of a few decades ago. Yeah, they love him. He's a man of Christ. That's who they like. And we're helping to subsidize it, potentially through the parsonage exemption, at least through their employees. But it gets better in the New York Times piece, which was a good expose, but the New York Times had to bend over backwards and say that, well, these are people with, quote, deeply spiritual feelings. And who do they cite as their source to say the Crouches have deeply spiritual feelings? Well, they cited relatives and employees. Yeah, they cited relatives and employees for the proposition that the Crouches have deeply spiritual feelings. Well, I'd have deeply spiritual feelings too, I guess, if somebody, gave me a couple jets and multiple mansions around the United States. That's very spiritual, you got to say. Talk about spirituality. Perfect. Now, they didn't happen to quote anyone on the other side who might say they're, con men. There's no one who said that. They didn't quote anyone, the New York Times, for that proposition. I thought that was a little bit timid on the part of the New York Times to sort of quote people for this unknowable proposition about their deep spiritual feeling. But the timidity goes on because with the IRS, important whether they're timid or not, the IRS is not timid at all if you have a conventional 501c3 nonprofit, because there's a rule for nonprofits about excess compensation. The IRS would love to go after your 501c3 nonprofit, but your 501c3 nonprofit might actually have a legitimate function, might not be giving millions to people, and might not have relatives packing the board, as happened in the Crouch's case. But yet, the IRS, when choosing between where to be timid, they are timid when it comes to the churches, as the New York Times correctly reports. And then it gets even more interesting because the New York Times labels certain ministers as conventional Christian leaders. How does the New York Times know what the definition of a conventional Christian leader is? I'd like to know. Because I'll tell you what the conventional Christian leaders in evangelical religion actually care about is not that the Crouches did this so much, is that they did it so blatantly. And this gets down to the really important part. of this issue. In 1970, there were fewer than 100 megachurches in the United States, defined as 2,000 or more on an average Sunday in an evangelical church. Fewer than 100 back then. It wasn't a major cultural force. Now there are hundreds upon hundreds of such churches, and lo and behold, sometimes they have 3, 4, 5, 6 ministers in each megachurch, many of whom are accessing this parsonage exemption. So in addition to the tax-deductible gifts they get, in addition to the sometimes extravagant compensations that are provided, they're actually saying, oh, we don't have to pay taxes on income that's relative to these homes, and they get to double dip with the IRS other exemptions, even though they're not actually paying in. So they get a double dip with their so-called parsonage exemption. And the problem that I think needs to be addressed isn't the tip-top people like the Crouches that you see every few years with some scandal. It's the rest of the iceberg of which they are merely the tip. And that's where I ask your help. What I want you to do is some real research. I don't mean going around harassing ministers or causing anyone any trouble. I want you to do real research. Look at tax records. Look at Google Maps. Look at the homes. Not the 7-figure homes. I mean, if you find a 7-figure home, certainly let me know about it. But what I'm thinking is much more important and much more widespread is you can live in some rural parts of the Midwest, have your mega ministry, and live in a rather extravagant home that's, say, $250,000 or $300,000. And that might be okay, not really, but it might be okay if there wasn't the parsonage exemption where they're getting this double dip IRS deduction that nobody else gets for this fancy home. I want you to go out there and look in your community at the mega ministers with appropriate, non-harassing, legitimate investigatory techniques to find out what are the values of these homes, what do they look like compared to the other homes in the community, are they the type of home that is clearly significantly above the typical home for the citizen in your region? Are they owners of extravagant cars? I don't want to hear about, oh, I saw a minister drive by in a Cadillac. But if you have clear, legitimate, well-researched evidence of an extravagant lifestyle that you can truly document, then I want to know about it. I want you to write me. I want you to email me at ministermoney, all one word, ministermoney at richarddawkins.net. That's ministermoney at richarddawkins.net. Because this is the Religio-Industrial complex. This is what people are not understanding. You know, I made a big deal of this back when I worked at Secular Coalition for America, and a student asked Vice President Biden about this, and Vice President Biden said, well, that's not a big issue, because Vice President Biden got elected back in 1970 when there were fewer than 100 megachurches. He doesn't perceive of the scale of this industry. He doesn't understand what's going on, and we need to document this by you doing research and sending it to me at ministermoney at richarddawkins.net. And then we can do something to strike a blow for truth about what's really happening with the Religio-Industrial complex. I hope you'll do that, and thanks for hearing me out.